Hey everyone, welcome to You Said What, where we look at the most memorable conversations and written interchanges in our lives. Today's guest is Jon Hilsenrath. Jon has covered markets and economic policy for about 25 years at the Wall Street Journal. You name the story. If it has to do with markets and the economy, Jon has probably written it. He also has a new book out about Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. We're going to talk about writing the book, as well as what he's learned about communication from years of covering the markets for a markets-obsessed readership. He's also a dad of 3. He says being a father and making decisions about how to communicate with his kids has actually taught him how to be a better communicator with adults. So we're going to explore that too. Jon, welcome. It's great to have you on the show.
Ernie, it's great to be here. And the one thing you forgot in your intro was that you and I worked together many years ago in Hong Kong. So it's a pleasure for me to be spending some time catching up with you.
Yeah, that's great. It's just going to bring me back. We're going to have to stop ourselves from reminiscing the whole time. Before we get into it, I just want to thank our sponsor, Pioneering Collective, an executive thought leadership firm combining personal PR, coaching, and networking to transform hard-earned wisdom into heavyweight impact. You can learn more at pioneeringcollective.com. Jon, you told me a story about a moment with one of your sons when he was 3 or 4 that 15 years later, you still think a lot about. Tell me about it.
It actually relates to Hong Kong. I mentioned Hong Kong a moment ago. So my family moved back from Hong Kong to New York in 2001. So it was more like 20 years ago. My oldest boy at the time was 3 or 4 years old. It was a challenging move for all of us, in part because my commute suddenly got really long and I was putting in a lot of hours trying to fit in on a new job. And my son, when we were back in Hong Kong, he and I loved to roughhouse with each other after I got home from work. And there wasn't as much time for roughhousing because I was commuting so much. Anyway, I got back late one night and he was staying up. I'd missed dinner. I was still in my suit and he said, "Dad, let's wrestle. Let's have our fight." And I said, "Okay, Alex, I just want to get out of my work clothes and then we could do it." And he said, no, I want to do it now. He was very impatient with me. So then he told me that he wanted to rip my arms and legs out of my body and throw my torso in the garbage.
Sounds like he had thought about this a little bit. He had mapped out.
No, I think he was reacting with some emotion. But so this is the moment where I had to decide, how do you respond when someone tells you they want to dismember you and throw you in the garbage? And, after a long day of work, this could have gone in many different directions for me. I was a bit exhausted and, I might have scolded him or sent him to his room and told him, "You don't talk to your father that way." But by chance and by luck, I chose a different path that night. And I said to him, "If you throw me in the garbage, then you're going to need a new father." And he said, "Yeah, I want a new father." And I said to him, "Okay, well, so what's your new father going to be like?" And he responded to me, this is a 4-year-old kid, right? And he responded to me, his new father isn't going to go into an office, isn't going to have a computer, and is never going to wear a suit. And it was just a really revealing and disarming moment for me because I saw in that moment how important it was how I responded to him and to take in what he was trying to say. And rather than react, to kind of let him go with whatever thought he was having and see where it took us. And it took the heat out of the moment. He got to say, he wasn't equipped to explain what he was feeling, which is that I just wasn't around enough now and he wanted to spend more time with me. He wasn't equipped to deal with those emotions. And by letting him kind of talk it out on his terms, we were able to get to a place where he got off his chest what he wanted to say. And I learned a lot about what was on his mind.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazingly articulate. As you said, he maybe expressed it differently than adults would have expressed it, but he got very quickly to what he was upset about. And it was like, couldn't have been clearer to you about what he wanted you to change, right?
Yeah. But not only that, but for me, what I learned was my own reaction. If I had sent him to his room, never would have gotten worked out. But the fact that I kind of grabbed this thought, I want to throw you away, and took it one step further and said, "Okay, well, you're going to need a new father. What's he going to be like?" was really a way to move the conversation forward. And, what does this mean in terms of how I communicate with adults is, for me, this was one of the most important lessons I've had in listening. Even as adults, we're not all equipped the same way to kind of share what we're thinking or what we're experiencing with each other. And, I kind of saw through the eyes of my own child how important it is to take a moment to kind of step into the other person's shoes, let them say what's on their mind and try to work it out. Now, fortunately, I had a cooperative communication partner in that one. It was a really big lesson for me on how to listen.
Does it led you to develop a sort of a system of sorts, an informal system where you kind of take a beat and instead of reacting immediately, you ask more questions? I know asking questions is part of your job, but outside of work, have you developed a system where you kind of like, again, I think we all have like gut reactions to things and it's easy to kind of have snap judgments, but do you try to take a deep breath and ask another question or two to kind of hear what's on people's minds? You do that, or have you always done that? Or
I definitely wouldn't say I have a system. I would say it's just more intuitive. I try to notice it when I can. Frankly, to be honest, perhaps I have less patience with adults than I do with my own child. And the lesson I should draw from that experience was that I should use some of the tools I use in my own household more in the office place. I mean, I try to do that, but when you're interacting with adults, you kind of put a different hat on sometimes. And maybe you do react more defensively because you have higher expectations of how they're going to communicate. So I wouldn't say I have a system. I would say I just need to be reminding myself of these stories on a regular basis so I could put the stories to work and how I behave. By the way, Ernie, this is what I call my, what do you do when someone tells you they want to dismember you and throw you in the garbage story?
I bet that gets people's attention.
Yeah, it's a good intro.
Well, it's a good segue into, you've been a reporter, writer, editor for years now and have had tons of interactions with readers and sources too. Has any of that story from working with kids or not informed how you deal with readers who are happy with what you do and who love what you do? That's not much of a struggle, but the ones who don't and who complain about it or who accuse you of making stuff up, or I'm sure you've experienced everything, but what's that like?
Well, it's not just readers, but it's also sources. And I'll talk about readers in a second, but as you were asking the question, I was thinking about sources, and there's kind of, my job as a journalist is to get information to help tell richer stories and to break stories. And there's different ways to do this. Some reporters can be very combative, and try to put a source in a corner. But I think what I get from that story is that you can sometimes elicit very useful information just by being civil with a person and finding ways to get them to feel comfortable talking. And this is what brings me back to the issue of sourcing. So, I used to cover the Federal Reserve, and from time to time, the reporters who cover the Fed would be challenged. In fact, I was challenged by Rick Santelli once on CNBC by people saying, we're too civil at these press conferences. We needed to challenge Fed officials on their policies and that we were going too easy on them. And what was kind of tricky for me to explain was, well, it wasn't tricky. You could ask a hard question without standing up and screaming at somebody. And that's often what I try to do. That's just my style. And it typically helps me to get information I need. So on this question of listening with sources, I've had some really, really interesting interactions. This is a very challenging time for journalists these days. Our email addresses are on our stories. We're very public figures. We're part of what many Americans consider to be an elite establishment that's let them down. And so readers regularly challenge me. And there are times when I can get defensive and combative with them, which isn't always the best way to manage things. But I've actually found that when I listen and pay attention to what they're saying, it leads me in interesting directions. And here's the most concrete example. When I was covering the Fed after the 2008 financial crisis, I would get a lot of critical notes from readers. It got to a point where people were so angry at the Fed. They were so angry about high unemployment and bailouts of banks, and they were angry at the reporters covering it. I would get death threats. On more than one occasion, I got death threats. And it started happening so regularly that it occurred to me that there was something more going on here. Like, this wasn't just some angry reader that I needed to just kind of not get worked up about. It occurred to me that there was an undercurrent of anger at American elites that I needed to investigate further. And we wrote a series of stories for the Wall Street Journal because of death threats that I got, called The Great Unraveling, which was about the economic roots of political discontent, which was why were Americans so angry? And we wrote stories about trade with China and how it tore apart many communities in industrial America. We wrote stories about bailouts of big banks. It really was a series that helped telegraph the rise of Donald Trump. So I think in that case, by listening to even, once again, my son wanted to dismember me, and it turns out so did Wall Street Journal readers. And by paying attention to that, I was able to produce a really impactful series of stories with my colleague, Bob Davis.
It's interesting, John. I think of all the politicized topics, I wouldn't have thought the Fed would be up there. But of course, everything's politicized now. Are you surprised at how politicized the Fed policy can get?
No, there's actually a long and very rich history of suspicion among Americans about the central bank and about big banks. When I talk about this, I love to point people to the play Hamilton. So Hamilton, in the book that the musical was based on, was the story of Alexander Hamilton, who created the country's first central bank, the Bank of the United States. And he had really kind of profound rivalries with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison about whether the United States should have a central bank. Americans in the heartland have very often been suspicious of bankers, and they've been especially suspicious of bankers in New York. Alexander Hamilton ended up being shot and killed in a duel by the vice president of the United States. And then Andrew Jackson shut down the Bank of the United States when it was up to have its charter renewed. And Andrew Jackson, this populist president, made a major part of his presidency an attack on the idea of paper money. And then when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, because there was so much suspicion of centralized financial power, it created 12 regional Fed banks around the country, exactly because people didn't want all the power concentrated in New York. So then fast forward to 2007, 2008, you have the Fed in the middle of a financial crisis that some people said it caused, bailing out Citigroup, bailing out Goldman Sachs and all these other banks. I remember talking to Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed at the time, and he told me he was expecting a big populist blowback. What surprised him was that the populist blowback came from the right of the political spectrum and not the left. In the end, it actually came out from both sides. But there's a lot of mystery about money and where it comes from and how it's created and who manages it. And where there's mystery and where there's chaos, you can get a lot of anger out of that.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that. I've, of course, seen Hamilton like a lot of people and didn't put that together. That's interesting. Obviously, as we're talking about here, covering the Fed and markets in general, economic policy, it's all incredibly sensitive. And if you say the wrong word, particularly if you work for the Wall Street Journal, you write the wrong word or say the wrong word, markets can jump or drop. And so you have to be super careful. What have you learned about precision in communications? I mean, I'm sure that precision has always been important to you. It has to be for all journalists. And in a high stakes job like you have, I'm sure it's always on your mind. But have you learned how little wiggle room there is in terms of interpretation and precision in a role like that, covering that kind of topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about language. So I'd say I've learned 2 or 3 things. One is I annoy a lot of family members. I keep coming back to my family because I'm like always stickling over words. If somebody uses the wrong word in the wrong context, I'm like, no, that's not the right word. What you meant is this. But yeah, I mean, precision is critical in what we do. And it's not just important to use precise words to describe, is the Fed considering half percentage point interest rate increase at its next meeting? Or, has it decided to do a half percentage point? There's a big difference between considering, right, decided, or started looking. There's a spectrum of how close they are to doing it. So you have to be really precise about how you describe it. But the other thing I've gotten more conviction on the longer I've become a journalist is not just to be precise with your words, but to be neutral in how you use them. Again, because the environment is so politically charged. And I think it's important for the Wall Street Journal as an institution, for me as a journalist who wants credibility with all readers, for people not to feel like I'm coming into any story with my fingers on the scale one way or another. So I try to avoid using adjectives and adverbs as much as I can.
Is that a new thing for you? Because I think, younger journalists are always taught, at least back in the day, we're taught to make things lively and kind of have a point of view.
You can write in really lively ways with verbs and nouns. I think when you use adjectives and adverbs, then you're starting to color a story from a point of view. And if you want to be a creative writer or whatever, that's fine. But if you want to be a journalist, you need to realize that little color, there are trigger words. And so here's another example. I think it's very important for a journalist to not use the language of protagonists or antagonists in a debate that I might be covering. I'll give you an example. I had a colleague write a story several years ago about a disagreement among labor unions about how to position themselves on some issue. I don't remember the specifics, but the reporter filed the story and used the term labor movement throughout the story, right? Now, just that one word movement to other editors at the paper was a trigger that this reporter was somehow oriented in favor of unions because unions describe themselves as a movement, right? A more neutral way of describing it was just say labor unions were debating or discussing this or that issue, not to say the labor movement. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah,
but it's just completely. I just feel like I have to be very disciplined to never, or I'll give you another example, with the riot that happened at the Capitol on January 6th and with the story that President Trump told about the election being stolen. Well, a lot of people called that the big lie. Well, I mean, that's what Democrats called it, but that's a charged term. And calling it an insurrection is also a charged term. Like no legal body has yet called it an insurrection. Riot was a more precise way of describing what happened there without casting judgment for or against any side, before any other kind of, legal body did. So I tried very hard not only to be precise, but to be neutral.
Yeah, I guess the word lie, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last 3-4 years, particularly in the Trump administration, about when it's okay to just call something a lie. Does lie imply an intent? Does it mean that the person knows that they're telling an untruth? What if the facts support the opposite of what that person's saying? Does that make it a lie? So it's an interesting discussion. And I think it's been interesting to see the media try to understand that, figure it out, decide what their policies are going to be on it. And I know the Journal's very serious about trying to play this down the middle.
For me, playing it down the middle doesn't mean, listen, like if one side is misstating everything and another side is not misstating anything, for me, neutrality doesn't mean like giving both sides an equal chance, equal weight in a story. For me, neutrality is just like presenting the facts, showing enough respect to the readers to let them draw their own conclusions about what's going on here, including those situations where the facts clearly indicate that one side is telling one untruth after another. But as soon as I call an untruth a lie, then, I'm putting my hand on the scale and saying, like you said, this person has intent and I'm making a judgment against it. So let's show enough respect to our readers to do the best we can to explain what's going on and let them draw their own conclusions. If you want them to take you seriously, you got to take their intelligence seriously.
You obviously put a lot of thought into how you characterize things to make sure that they're not loaded. Do you think that readers appreciate that and notice that? Like I've been aware of the last 3-4 years, there's a lot of, it feels like people make efforts to do things like that and nobody's paying attention because at the end of the day, they kind of have their mind made up about what something is or what it isn't or what some person is or what they aren't. Do you get feedback from readers that say, hey, Jon, I'm a big fan and I really appreciate, you're not loaded on stuff. You don't take sides on these things. You just present the facts and let us make up our own minds.
Hey, Ernie, was that you who wrote that the other day to me?
The one guy who wrote this or no? How often do you get that?
It's a good question. It's kind of what you would expect. The people who want to complain are the ones who are more likely to reach out to you. So I get a lot of people challenging biases and accusing me of biases that, I try very hard not to interfere with my work. And, I got to use those accusations sometimes as a gut check to make sure that I'm being true to what I'm saying. Every now and then I get that comment from somebody saying, I really appreciate what you're doing here. That's always really nice to hear. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, it's just a fact of kind of what I'm doing that you have to have a bit of a thick skin.
It's not a popularity contest.
Yeah, when you're on a public stage, people aren't going to applaud until you leave it.
You do a bunch of TV, or always did when I knew you, and I'm sure you still do, maybe more. What have you learned about that in terms of the ability to communicate in different ways with people, the power of that message? Is that waning as media changes? Is it still as potent as it always was?
Well, boy. The cable television system right now, it's a really challenging terrain to navigate. Like I've got this little theory that people have their views of their identity. People see themselves as kind of a red or a blue. I mean, a lot of people see themselves as like, I'm impartial, I'm independent, but people tend to gravitate in groups of reds and blues. I mean, it seems to be a fact of our life. And so the cable system, especially in the Trump era, really kind of was there reinforcing people's belief systems, giving them fodder for how they already saw the world. It was a tough and frustrating environment.
Well, I can imagine for somebody like you, if you go on Fox Business, for example, and they have their own idea of what, just to throw out an example, there's stuff on the other side as well, but that they have their own idea of what's going on in Washington, and you come on and trying to do exactly what you've just been talking about for the last 15 minutes of staying really neutral, being very methodical about how you say things. Can you do that in that environment without getting pushed in a direction that is not really where you want to go?
It's hard. It's very hard. So first of all, I don't do any of the opinion shows. I try to just do the straight news shows. But even, during, in like 2020 in the aftermath, it was hard even to do that. If you're out there trying to be a truth teller and someone says, for instance, well, all this kind of immigration against the border is causing the spread of COVID because people are bringing COVID from Mexico. This is something I once heard. And I say, well, there's actually no factual evidence for that. New Mexico actually has very low COVID hospitalization rates, and it's right on the border and has very high Hispanic population percentages. But, so I might be trying to just kind of speak facts, but just the fact that I'm contradicting someone who makes an assertion puts me in a position where it sounds like I'm taking a position and people are going to react to that. And this, I guess, leads me to another thing, which is that, and like, I don't want to sound self-righteous about this stuff, but like, I can try really hard to be neutral and precise and to kind of live by this value system that I have, that I've learned at the Wall Street Journal over 25 years of, just trying to tell good, truthful stories. At the end of the day, and this also gets to how I covered the Fed, at the end of the day, you can't control how people are going to react to things that you do. So I would write a story back, when the Fed was launching all these economic stimulus programs in 2012, 2013, saying the Fed was considering a new bond buying program to lower long-term interest rates. I would say the Fed is considering, they're in the early stages. They still have to have several debates. This could take several months. I could say all these things, and then the market would go nuts and say, this is happening tomorrow. Right. And, and I would have had like long debates and battles with my editors to make sure that we don't overstate the headline. And I could do all of this. And at the end of the day, you put it out. And like, if the market is going to freak out about that, I can't control how other people take my efforts to put it out there. I can just do the best I can. And then, you have to kind of give people space to respond the way that they're going to respond. And at the end of the day, you got to hang your hat on, all right, did I do, the best I could do in that situation?
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to shift gears for a second and talk about your new book, Yellen, the Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. It's a cool story about big debates and shifts in economic policy over the last 25 years, but it's also a love story. Talk about that.
This is kind of what drew me to this story. Janet Yellen is married to a Nobel Prize winning economist named George Akerlof. And between the two of them, they've really been in the middle of almost every major economic debate in theory and policy in the last 60 years. From the big debates that went on between Milton Friedman and James Tobin in the 1960s and 70s over what's the role of markets and government in managing the economy, to something that became known as behavioral economics, where economists started to realize that markets can sometimes fly off in wild and dangerous directions, to running the central bank. The two of them were involved in all of this, and they've been married for 44 years. They have a sweet love story, which also kind of helps to tell the story of women in the workplace, because they met at the Fed in the 1970s. Their first date, George had this wild dog, half pit bull terrier, half Dalmatian, that had torn his apartment apart, and Janet shows up. She's this like very kind of methodical, by the book person. And somehow this yin and yang fit. They decided to marry almost within weeks. And it was George's view that Janet's career mattered just as much as his in their family life, and that his role in parenting and keeping the household together mattered just as much as hers. And so they forged an equal partnership in raising their son, Robbie, and in also kind of moving from place to place and taking job to job. And he became a really important support system for her. They created a modern family that kind of gave her the room to break all these glass ceilings and also gave him the room to forge a really cool relationship with his son, Robbie, who followed in his footsteps and became an economic theorist. So the book tells the story of modern economics, but it tells it through these three characters
Who all happen to be in the same family.
who are all in the same family. And then I think anyone can identify with, in terms of just managing stuff like, who's going to pick the kid up at school today? Who's making dinner? Should we move for your job or should we stay for my job? Like, these are all decisions they managed over and over again. It's a really personal way to tell a story of modern economics.
So I get how you'd be interested in modern economics because you've been writing about it for a long time. And so I can imagine how that book idea would come to you. But how does this whole interweaving of a love story and women's rights and family life and modern economics, how does that idea come to you? How did you come up with the book idea?
It came to me where every kind of useful idea comes to a person in the shower. So like people had said to me before, they're like, oh, you should write a book about Janet Yellen, first woman to ever run the Fed. And I never felt it, so to speak. It was never intuitive to me because, you've seen her on TV. She's like, she can sound like this kind of really kind of methodical, drone-like person when she's talking about policy. And it literally popped in my head when she became the Treasury Secretary. And by the way, behind the scenes, she's not that totally methodical person. She's got a great sense of humor. She likes to throw down a martini after a hard day of work. And she and George have this kind of great interplay. They laugh a lot with each other. But after she became the Treasury Secretary, I was like, wow, she really is a historic figure right now. She's broken every glass ceiling in her field and is the most accomplished woman in American economic history. And really, the economists of her generation, which includes Larry Summers and a lot of other important people, who was really at the bridge of the ship through everything. And then it popped in my head and occurred to me that the way to tell this, I knew she had an important story to tell, but then it occurred to me literally in the shower instantaneously that the way to tell the story was through her family life. And that by doing that, I could tell a story that was much bigger than her and much bigger than her husband. That was a story of modern economics and stuff. And that has its own narrative arc, right? So, what my book does is the first half and the second half. The first half is kind of all the battles over markets and free markets and all that, kind of going up to the year 2000, and the economy in the United States emerges at the end of the 1990s as the world's great superpower. And our expectation is that China and Russia are going to follow our lead. We will lead a world of like-minded, democratic, market, capitalist-oriented countries that trade with each other and are at peace with each other. And the last 20 years didn't work out that way. And that's an economic story. So on the one hand, this story tells a sweet story about Janet Yellen and her husband and about all the glass ceilings she broke, which is, a nice story about her. But on the other hand, it talks about all the bad things that have happened, which raises questions about, how she did as a policymaker that I get into and examine.
So you come up with this idea in the shower, you're like, okay, this is it. Obviously, at some point you presented it to Janet Yellen and her family, and then did they instantly say, yeah, we're on board? Or was it some push and pull to try to start working on the project?
That's a good question. Well, the first piece of feedback I got from George was that he didn't think I could pull it off.
Which part of it?
Just the whole thing, the whole concept, and this is a guy who won a Nobel Prize in economics.
He has the right to make a judgment like that.
Yeah, he was like, I think you're trying to do too much. He's like, good luck. But I knew Yellen for many years from my time covering the Fed. And I think she saw that I was a straight shooter and, honest guy. And I wasn't out to make anybody look bad or make anybody look good. So there was an element of trust there. I also, by the way, knew Akerlof when he won his Nobel Prize. I was the guy who called him up that Tuesday morning to interview him for the story the Wall Street Journal was going to write about him winning a Nobel Prize. So we had known each other and there was an element of trust. And, their inclination was to cooperate with me.
When you said the inclination was to cooperate with you, you couldn't have really done it if they didn't, right? It wouldn't be the same book.
Yeah. If I had gotten an indication that they weren't going to cooperate, that they weren't going to talk, then I was going to have to.
You're going to do it anyways?
Well, I don't know. That's what this is what you always face as a journalist, right? Sometimes you go to a source and you're like, I'm doing this story, and they want to cooperate and they want to be sure that you hear their side of the story. There's other times when you go to them and they're like, they don't want to have anything to do with it. And you got to tell them, well, I'm doing it anyway. This is the Wall Street Journal and we're writing this story. And then there's like give and take and stuff like that. So there's always that And it was complicated because Yellen is the Treasury Secretary. It's not like she's left the stage and is in a position to tell all. She's in a very political position as the Treasury Secretary. So on the one hand, for a lot of the historical stuff, I think that they felt pretty comfortable talking to me. But I felt it was important that they had to know I'm a journalist. So this wasn't an authorized biography, so to speak. It was something I chose to do, and I was going to do it on my terms. Their only condition was that if I used any quotes from the conversations I had with them, they had to agree to the quote that I took out of the conversation, which is something that happens fairly commonly. And it's actually, in the end, very often when I get into these situations, I end up not using a lot of quotes from people because I don't want them having that much leverage over what I write. So I actually ended up not using a ton of their firsthand quotes in the story, but it's informed by hours and hours and hours of discussion with them. And they'd put conditions on, what could be in it or what couldn't be in it.
So beyond that, what was the communication process like with them over the months that you were working on this? I mean, did you have a regular Tuesday, Thursday block of time in which you got together? Was it every weekend? Did you email stuff to them and then talk about it? What was the back and forth like in terms of how you got the material?
The book has 20 plus chapters, and I would go at it chapter by chapter and report it out. So there was a fair amount of back and forth as I was learning stuff. The one thing I will say is that I started doing the book in the early months of the Biden administration when Yellen was kind of consumed with learning a new job in the middle of a COVID crisis and economic crisis. So I spent a lot of time early on getting to know George and Robbie Akerlof better. And then I moved from that to getting later in the process into deeper conversations with Yellen. They were very generous with their time. And a lot of this was during COVID. So we were limited in how much face-to-face there could be. There were a lot of telephone conversations. It also kind of depends on an individual style. George loves to talk on the phone.
Have you been surprised by the reaction in any way, either things that people love that you didn't think, were such a big part of the book, or things that people haven't really paid attention to that you thought were a big part of the book, or has it been kind of as you expected?
My biggest surprise is that it wasn't a complete and utter nightmare.
The creation of the book or the response to the book?
Everything.
Yeah.
I've had so many friends and colleagues who've written books. You see them in the middle of the process and they're like, why did I get into this? And, and I'm never going to get this done. Oh my God, I'm only halfway through and I got, 2 months to go, stuff like that. And for me, that's me knocking on wood. It went the way I hoped it would go in the shower that day.
Your publisher didn't have to threaten to pull back your advance because
I met all my deadlines.
That's
and I'm
amazing.
like, I'm still calling them. I'm like, hey, I haven't gotten my advance. The book came out and like, where's my next payment? So then the question is, well, what lesson do you have to learn from that? I think one of the important lessons I had is I said no many times to ideas about doing books. I had friends. They were like, oh, you've been at the Journal forever. Like, why haven't you written a book? Everybody, anyone who's anybody in journalism writes a book. Why haven't you done it? Or I thought this was like the crowning achievement for a journalist. And, and then every now and then you have agents calling you up. They see a story you like and they're like, how about a book? And I just never really felt like I had a story that kind of was big enough or meaningful enough or that I was informed enough about to be worth investing that kind of time and energy in. When I had the idea, there are certain beautiful moments in storytelling. It doesn't happen often, but there's certain beautiful moments where you can see the story from beginning to end. In journalism, a lot of time, you're just throwing it together. You're on deadline. You're figuring it out as you go. Every now and then, like the stars aligned and you can see the thing from beginning to end. I always know in those cases, this is going to work. I was lucky. This is one of those situations. And the lesson I learned from it was that it was a prudent decision for me to have said no so many other times when it just wasn't right, when it wasn't like hanging together.
You weren't feeling it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to just close with, we started with a family story, one of your kids. Let's close with another story with one of your kids. You told me another story about, I think, your other son when he was older in high school that you also think a bunch about. Tell us about that one.
I'll call this story 3 Precious Words, and I'll try to make it relatable.
I think we've got your next book, John. It's just a bunch of stories. So they've like you and your kids. You've already got the chapter headings.
No, they don't. They're not going to want any of this. They won't want me telling like the really good stuff. So anyway, I've got my youngest boy, Lucas, is an athlete, and he played all kinds of sports as a kid. He played football in high school, and he also played lacrosse. We live in Maryland, which is a big state that's really into lacrosse. When he was little, he decided they had really cool shorts that the kids wore. They were really colorful shorts, and he wanted shorts. And I was like, well, I'll buy you the shorts, but you got to play the game. So anyway, he got really good at lacrosse to the point where he was getting recruited to play in college. And the way the recruiting system works is that kids' junior year, all the college coaches come out and start watching them play in these tournaments. And he had gotten word that the head coach of Harvard wanted to look at him and see how he performed. They were interested in him. So at these tournaments that the kids play at, the college coaches are lining the sideline, and there's a lot of pressure on these kids to perform. They feel like there's, their whole future is on the line. And so Luke went out and played, and he was awful. He just didn't do anything. He didn't do anything special. And then the Harvard coach got up and walked away. We had a long ride home ahead of us. Like, he knew he didn't play well. I knew he didn't play well. And I knew that it was going to be on his mind and bothering him. And so the question that I had in my head is, like, what do I say to this kid who thinks his dream just got shot down because of the way he performed on the field that day? And I just kind of left it to be quiet for a little while. We had a long ride from New York back to Maryland. We pulled off to get some dinner. He likes pasta. So I was like, let's have a nice Italian dinner. So we pull off in Manhattan, and we hadn't talked for like an hour. I just kind of let it be quiet. And then as we're walking into this restaurant, I turned to him. And again, this was instinctive. This was like reflexive. And I was like, Luke, I don't care. Those were my three precious words. I was like, I don't care. I don't care if you get recruited to play any sport in college. I don't care if you play a sport. I don't care if you go to Harvard or the local community college. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that I'm on your side. I'm on your team no matter what. And I never thought that the three words, I don't care, would come out of my mouth. He probably doesn't even remember this, but for me, they just had a lot of meaning in terms of the message I sent to him, that what matters in this relationship is, like, you got nothing to prove, and I'm on your team no matter what. Maybe that's a lesson that kind of transfers into the workplace and in other forms of family life too, that, we live in a high pressured society with expectations on everyone, especially our children. And, maybe it helps sometimes for people just to know that they got someone on their team, whether they fail this time or not.
Well, I think also the spareness of it is sort of powerful. Like, I think the inclination would be to say, hey, you didn't do so bad, try to get them to think like, hey, it's not so, but you knew that he didn't do that great. He knew he didn't do that great. You knew that he knew. And so, like, you're not going to try to change that.
Yeah, no BS. And, no pumping them up. No, like, you're still great. I still love you. Like, you did this well. And there's all these other, it's like, no, it's like, you suck. Right. I'm not going to say that, but it's kind of at the end of the day, it's just like, all right, that happened.
John, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to get a chance to talk with you and go through the years of the communications lessons and experiences that you've had. It's really enjoyed it. Thank you again.
Yeah, and Ernie, I always had great conversations with you in the newsroom. So I knew this would be fun, and I love the title of your show, and I'm glad to be a part of it because I think it's going to be a great success.
Thank you, John. I love stories where kids prove that they're way smarter than we give them credit for. I have to admit, I'm also a sucker for stories about the magic that can happen when we turn up the dial on our listening skills just a little bit. I know it's a cliche, but I do think you learn something when you listen. John's kind of a poster child for that. He's a lifelong reporter, and he's learned how to interact with all kinds of readers, including readers that don't agree with what he's written and don't like the stories that he's written and are cranky, or even more than that, make death threats. He's an author who spent months getting to know the subjects of his book, which you can only do if you spend a lot of time listening. And yes, he's the dad of a 3-year-old son who announced one day that he wanted to tear his limbs off. Be open to hearing other people, however off-putting or challenging their message, and then have a thick skin. I think that's kind of what it boils down to. Got a conversation or written interchange that changed your life? Let me know about it, and we can talk about it on the show. Thanks for listening to this episode of You Said What, and I'll see you next week.